All right, cool. Well, I hope you're all doing well on this fine Friday morning. It's finally getting cold outside. Like it's kind of chilly in the mornings, which is awesome. We can do away with all this heat. So, a couple documents today, and then if you guys have any questions about the paper or about the upcoming exam, this is a great time to ask. But we can bang out these documents first. So first we have Aristotle. Aristotle's one of the big three, I guess. He's one of the three major like Greek philosophers that we know and love. He's a student of Plato. Plato himself kind of forms the bridge between Socrates and Aristotle. Socrates taught Plato and Plato taught Aristotle. And so we have this kind of lineage here of really smart guys who wrote a lot of stuff for us to read in the present and to try and figure out what they were talking about. Sometimes it gets high-minded, but for the most part, these guys are just trying to explore truth. Like they're trying to get a grasp on, through the mode of philosophy, how do we know what we know about the world? What kinds of questions should we be asking about the world to gain a better understanding of it? When it comes to Aristotle in particular, in this document at least, he's concerned with government. Like what constitutes a good government? Like how should people be living in community with each other in a peaceful and efficient way? And so he kind of helps invent political science in this document. And so we'll explore that a little bit. So according to Aristotle then, what is a state? What constitutes a state?
He says that there has to be a union of people that would otherwise not be working together.
Okay, good then. Yeah, it's this community of people, a union of people who live together for mutual benefit. If they did not live together, they would not be as prosperous, or perhaps they wouldn't survive. So at a fundamental level, the state is a community of people. And by the way, when I say state, and this is going to be important, I think, to remember for all of our readings going forward, really anytime that you hear politics discussed, both in history and the present, when we say state, we mean like a sovereign government. We don't mean like Illinois or West Virginia or Arizona. Like we don't mean like a subset of like a country. That's how we use state in the United States, and it's very confusing. But a state generally just refers to a group of people that have sovereignty, that's like make their own laws, that have their own boundaries. Basically a country, right? That's what the state is. So when you hear the word state, referred to in historical terms or political science terms, they're really talking about a country. So what's the point of having a constitution? Like, why do we have a constitution in the US? Why do we have that? And what point does it serve?
To establish the rules of how these people will work together. It basically establishes, because you need a group of people and you need some form of rule, but it's best to have it documented and expressed specifically. Mm-hmm. It represents the values of the people and how they're going to work together.
Okay, good. So we have the state, which is this collection of people. We need some rules by which to govern these people so that they can live in harmony with each other. And so this idea of the Constitution is like this list of rules of like what you can and cannot do, or the the division of power within this community. Is this a new idea? Have we talked about constitutions already in this class? Like if a constitution is like a list of rules to follow, have we already accidentally discussed a constitution?
The code of rules.
Yeah. Yeah, Code of Hammurabi would be one, right? Like we could look at that. That's a body of laws saying what people in Babylon can and can't do. Well, you know, how is that different than a constitution? A constitution is a body of laws that governs how people, you know, behave. So yeah, we basically have already talked about a constitution in this class, right? Or maybe you could look at the Hebrews. Like you could look at the Torah. Like it's at once, it's part theology and their kind of belief system in God, but it's also like, you know, if you commit adultery, you get put to death. Like it's a list of rules to govern society. So anytime you have like this kind of body of laws or body of rules and regulations, you have a state. You have a, to put it crudely, you know, a country already. But Aristotle's trying to hammer out this idea of kind of like what exactly constitutes, you know, the state. What constitutes a body politic? So he goes on to discuss this a little bit, and Ben put it right. You know, this is the Constitution serves as a way to govern people's behavior and to punish people who step out of line and things like that. What are the main types of government that Aristotle explores? What kinds of governments can you have?
There's either like democracy or like some form of like oligarchy.
Yeah. I think the way he puts it is, you know, you can be ruled by one person, a king. You can be ruled by a few, or an oligarchy. Or you can be ruled by many, which is democracy, right? Or a republic. Yeah, good. And Aristotle, as someone who grew up in Athens, is very familiar with the third one of those, but most other places in the world are governed either by an oligarchy or by a king, you know, or maybe like a tribal chief or, you know, something like that. So to him, what is the point of even having a government? Like what role should whether it's a king or an oligarchy or a democracy, what is the job of a government supposed to be?
Promote.
To keep people from going to their nature and to just live in a very small, you know, like live with just their family and fight for resources, to preserve just themselves and their small family and no one else.
Okay.
To stop people from being selfish and hurting each other, warring constantly.
Okay. All right. I'm going to come back to that. Caleb, what were you going to say?
I was just gonna say, like, to promote a life worth living, he kind of.
So would it be fair to say that generally life for most people is better when you live in a collective society governed by laws? Yeah, that's the idea of politics, right? Is like people actually work better when there's more of them, when they have common ground. They're not, like Ben said, divided into small family groups or tribes fighting each other for limited resources. Why don't we pool our resources? Why don't we come together and live harmoniously? Because that affords us more protection, it provides us more opportunity, it provides us with more security for generations going forward. Like basically he's talking about civilization, right? Like he's talking like people are better together than apart. Do you buy that? Do you think that's true? Or are people actually better off having their natural freedoms and living in kind of a state of nature you know, society can suck sometimes.
A lot of them. You can't just like have the government do everything, tell you all what to do. You gotta have some of those freedoms. But if you don't have like government helping you, then it's just basically a war zone everywhere you go.
Okay. So it is worth it to sacrifice some of your natural freedoms to enjoy security and safety in numbers and things like that. Yeah. Does anyone disagree with that? Are there any anarchists in this class that are like, nah, down with society, man? Like, tear down the state. It's okay if you don't want to identify yourself and you're a closet anarchist. I understand. Just by means of being a college professor, apparently I'm a communist, Marxist, socialist who's trying to pervert the youth of America. So I understand if you want to stay in the shadows.
Technically, you could say that psychology and sociology are far more communist because you actually learn about Karl Marx.
Yeah. No, I know. Well, just the idea, I mean, you know, joking aside, like the questions that we're raising, that Aristotle right here is raising, like, is it better to live communally than individually? And he says yes. I mean, that's a really basic idea. But what people throughout history they build on that idea, and they're like, how communal should we get with our resources, right? Like, or the lines that we draw between people, you know, as tribes come together and they form societies and cultures and then cities and then countries and empires, at what point do we all just start looking at each other as people and not dividing each other by class, by race, by the haves and have-nots, you know, by religion, by language, where you live, what you believe? You know, at what point do we just when we draw lines in the sand to divide people, is that a natural thing to do? Or is that completely arbitrary and it just leads to conflicts? And, you know, or should we just see each other all as people? Not to get too off topic, but like, you know, talking about the psychology and sociology of this stuff is kind of important, because Aristotle kicks off a conversation about what constitutes a good government or a good state. And it keeps going all the way into the present day, including talking about communism. You know, communism is an attempt to answer this question and say, workers of the world unite. You know, all working class people are one people, regardless of where you live on the planet. And that's up to you to decide if it's valid or not. I don't care. I don't care what you believe, you know, just as long as you are thinking through what you do believe. So what constitutes the best form of government in Aristotle's view? Like, what's the best kind of political community that you can forge? Does he have a favorite?
Something led by the middle class more than anybody else.
Okay. What kind of government would that be, do you think? Like, of the three, you know, the kings, the oligarchy, and the democracy, which of those would best represent, you know, or best fit rule by the middle class of people?
Would be the democracies.
Democracy?
Yes. He says democracies are safer and more permanent than, like he says, oligarchies, because the middle class, which is more numerous, is great share.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you guys agree with that? Like, is this a good diagnosis? I mean, I know we're living in, you know, the United States in the 21st century, so we're all a little democratically inclined, but there's problems with democracy, right? Like, wouldn't it be better to have to be ruled by like a few group of people, like a small group of people who were really smart and knew what they were doing and didn't empower the crazies out there?
They're likely to become power hungry themselves, so I would say no.
Ah, okay.
Also, how can you ensure that they're all smart and they're acting for the best interest of everyone? Because they're the only people who are checking themselves.
Yeah. So better to be ruled by the tyranny of the majority in democracy, no matter how poorly educated people are or how stupid or like what kind of crazy conspiracy theories they believe in, that's still the best way to go, to give everyone a chance to vote and have a say.
I don't think it really
Majority
matters.
can always
People
change.
suck in general, and we all
People
want our
in
own
power
vote. So
sometimes
whatever we do is
stop
going to
there.
go to shit at the end of the day.
Okay, so, sorry, Josh, can you say that again? You got washed out a little bit.
I mean, I feel like it doesn't really matter what our government is because people are always going to be self-important. They're going to look to better themselves. So if you give them power, it's going to turn to shit at the end of the day.
Oh, wow. Oh boy. So we got to burn it all down every so often, have a revolution and set up something better.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, you were in my History 102 class, and we definitely went through the revolutionary stuff. So, yeah. Seth, were you going to say something?
Yeah, a majority can always change. Like, you get enough votes, get enough people can change it. If you just have a small group in charge, it's almost impossible to change without a whole war happening or something like that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, the majority can change its mind about things. It's not permanent. It can shift around. Different people groups can constitute that majority to lead a democracy, and different ideas can come in and out. Whereas it's harder for like a king to change his ways, or for a group of, rich oligarchs, which is, by the way, kind of currently the governments of Russia, of China to some extent. These are oligarchies, and they're not exactly looking out for the greater good. They're looking out for themselves first and foremost. Okay, so that's an advantage that democracy has. Yeah, and I think that's what Aristotle's trying to get at here too. Caleb, did you have something you want to add?
I was just gonna say, there's no like way to guarantee in like an oligarchy or like a monarchy that the successors are also going to be. If you have a good ruler, there's no guarantee that the next one will be, and they're longer lasting, so you're stuck with them.
Yeah, good. In my other class, we just got done talking about the French Revolution, and part of the reason that came about, France had 3 pretty crappy kings in a row, and combined, that's like over 100 years rule of just like incompetency. And even if you had like one king, a good king that came in and like knew what he was doing, there's no guarantee that, the next person in the dynasty line is going to be as smart as his dad. So absolutely. And this is all, to Aristotle, this is the point of talking about politics, trying to figure out what constitutes the best way of people living together. That's all politics is. Who gets power, who gets a say in what happens, how permanent should things be, or should we change things from time to time? How people interact with each other on a fundamental level, that's politics. And so Aristotle's trying to get to the he's starting from the lowest common denominator of like what constitutes a state, what constitutes a group of people trying to get along. And then we can work from there on like how to perfect these things. But we got to start basic at the beginning. So Aristotle kind of invents political science here in this document. Congratulations, you're all political scientists now as a result of reading this. That moves us forward to Alexander the Great. Fun fact, Alexander himself was educated by Aristotle for a few years. Aristotle was his private tutor and teacher. And so you have one of the smartest guys in Greece educating a king. And you get some really interesting results from that. Alexander is, this is discussed in your book a little bit, but he's kind of Greek, kind of not. He's kind of thrown in with the Greeks though, because it's close enough. Like Macedonia is like basically Greece, but they don't consider themselves Greek. They consider themselves better than the Spartans, than the Athenians, and everybody else running around in Greece. The Macedonians are a different breed. But nonetheless, Alexander is king of all of Greece. He conquers Greece early in his career as a king. And he goes on to conquer most of the known world. He's one of the greatest warriors history has ever seen. He's a brilliant strategic mind when it comes to military maneuvers. He, several occasions, defeats the much larger Persian army. He invades Persia. Instead of Persia invading Greece, he's like, it's our turn to strike back. He goes all Ender's Game on this. And he invades Greece and wins. And overthrows the king Darius III of Persia. So by the time we get to this document, one of the biographers of Alexander is kind of following him around and writing about Alexander's, how he's treating people and how he views people in his empire. And so, I hope you read this. It's a pretty readable thing. After having read it, what does the story tell you about Alexander the Great?
Very egotistical, and he thinks very, very highly of himself.
To say the least, yes. He's got a big head on that shoulder, his shoulders. He's very egotistical. What else is he?
For all of his faults, he was a good man because he did pay all of his soldiers wages even when they...
Okay. Yeah, okay, so his heart is in the right place when it comes to looking after his people. The Macedonian soldiers who have marched thousands of miles behind him to conquer the known world. At the end of the day, he has his scuffles with them, but at the end of the day, he loves them and he wants to take care of them. Okay. What other characteristics do you see in Alexander here? What other things stood out to you about him?
Well, one thing, which is more of an example, but I say he doesn't follow, to an extent, very strong biases, because it says that he has a very close relationship with the Persian commanders whom he adopted. I don't know whether or not he defeated them at some point, but he thinks highly of them, and they're the only people who get to be this close to him and to have these privileges. He doesn't even give it to the Macedonians. So that could imply that he rewards people on their own merits and not on whether they are of his same culture or family.
Okay, great, excellent. That's exactly where I was hoping to go with this. He goes to Persia, he conquers it, and yet he doesn't enslave everybody there. He doesn't treat Persia the way that the Persians treated Greece, when they rolled through and conquered, the Ionian coastline and invaded at Marathon and burned down Athens. Like, he's embracing the Persians in some way. He respects them on some level, right? And I agree. I don't know if he defeated them, like these particular guys, in battle, but he respects them, and he's even placed them above the Macedonian commanders in some way, which leads to the whole kerfuffle that the story talks about. So this gives you an interesting view into Alexander's worldview, like the way that Alexander views his empire that he's constructing there on the fly. He's like, you know what? It's not going to work if we treat the Persians as lesser than. We need to, on some level, respect them and bring them into the conversation. So, I think we all kind of know why the Macedonians get upset. This was just a question I asked just to help you get the main idea here. But the Macedonians that have been with Alexander this whole time see Alexander as going native. I don't know if you've ever heard that term before. It's kind of a derogatory thing. When someone from another culture gets embedded into your culture and they start adopting your ways, the people back home are going to get mad. If I go over to France and I start speaking French and taking naps in the middle of the day and, eating cheese all the time and surrendering, people are going to see me, sorry, but people are going to see me as like less American. I'm gone native with the Frenchies. I'm going to start eating frog legs and snails and stuff. And that would be detrimental, to one's identity. So the Macedonians get mad at Alexander. He starts dressing like a Persian. He starts having chats with Persian generals. He takes their advice over the Macedonians. He also, this isn't mentioned in the document, he marries a Persian woman. He takes to wife a member from a completely different culture in order to produce kids that will rule over a cosmopolitan empire who see themselves as neither Greek nor Persian, but someone as a people group that's broader than that. This does not go over well with the Macedonians, and they threaten to mutiny. How does Alexander react to this mutiny that's forming?
Well, of course he doesn't take it very well, but in particular, he basically says, well, I achieved all of this, and you guys didn't. So I don't think you guys can tell me whether or not I know what I'm doing. Basically, I mean, it's oversimplified, but he basically just has like this long speech and just like yells at them. Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, do you think that's fair? Is this a fair statement from Alexander? I did this, you guys didn't do anything.
No, I don't think that's fair, but I also still agree that he should be able to do whatever he wants. If he wants to dress Persian or have a Persian wife.
Right.
It's kind of, I agree with his actions, but I don't agree with his logic behind it.
Okay. Yeah, here's Alexander's ego, coming to the fore again. I built this empire. You guys just followed behind. You're riding my coattails. Like, sure, you followed me into battle, but like, look at all the scars I have. I was in battle too. So, and then at the end of this, how does he reconcile with his men? How does he prevent this mutiny from happening? And I think Joanna was kind of on the right track with this earlier. How does he reconcile and how does he make this mutiny go away?
He compensates them financially for their assistance.
Yeah, thank you for your service. Here's a bunch of spoils of war. Go back home with it. How else? Is it just does he just pay them off, or?
I mean, the whole thing is that he wouldn't let them kiss him, and then he's like, "Yeah, you can kiss me again," and then
he made them all really emotional and
Yeah.
got all deep in his feelings and stuff.
Yeah, he became vulnerable after throwing his hissy fit and storming out. He kind of comes back and he's like, guys, look, I effed up a little, I got mad. You guys have followed me to literally the end of the earth as we know it, and he becomes vulnerable, and there's this weird kind of homoerotic thing that's going on here, of like men kissing each other and stuff. And I don't want to get too into that. There are some really weird sexual norms in the Greek camp at this time. Alexander was probably bisexual, from what we understand, you know. So, you know, it gets a little weird for some people to read this in the modern era, but nonetheless, those are the bonds he's formed with his men over time. And he's like, you know what, it was wrong for me to shut you out of my intimate circle. So what does this story tell us? And this speaks directly to, you know, the paper assignment for the day. What does this story tell us about, you know, how the Greeks and Alexander and, you know, the Macedonians, like, in other words, people living on that side of the Aegean Sea, you know, how do they view Persia? How do they view the wider world?
They viewed themselves as better.
Yeah, so they definitely view themselves as better. They refer to the Persians frequently as barbarians. You know, Alexander says that multiple times in this document. They're barbarians. But are they treated like barbarians, though? Are they treated like a people who should be conquered and, you know, enslaved? Like, what's the main difference here?
The Greeks in the West value freedom and stuff more than like the East, who values like empires, like in terms of like controlling.
Yeah, we get this weird fusionism, don't we, of cultures where Alexander, you know, believes in kind of more independent involvement in government. He's educated by Aristotle. You know, he's constantly thinking about like what constitutes a good government. And even though he's a king, he's not out to rule an empire like the Persians had, right? He doesn't place himself in kind of this deific position. He kind of flirts with the godhood a little bit, but at the end of the day, he's still Greek, you know, and he believes in a more cosmopolitan, multicultural world where there's room for diversity, there's room for disagreement. You know, he even acknowledges the disagreements that his own men have with him. And at the end of the day, he makes amends with that. And he's like, you know what? That's the kind of world I want to live in. That's the kind of empire I want to forge. So I want you to think about that as you go forward, especially in writing the assignment, if you haven't already. There's a fundamental difference in how people in Persia viewed Greece, or at least the rulers of Persia, and then how the important people in Greece view the other side of the world. Like, there's this East and West dichotomy that, starting under Alexander and going into the future, you know, the West views itself as very distinct than the East, but they're not entirely disrespectful of other cultures. They don't write them off completely. You know, sometimes it's okay to learn and collaborate and to borrow from the East and how we think about our own culture. And that's something that's very fundamentally ingrained, I think, in Western civilization. You know, we're not perfect at it, but we do acknowledge diversity on some fundamental level and acknowledge it as a good thing and not a bad thing. All right. Well, does anyone have any other questions, any other comments, any concerns? All right, cool. Well, if you need help with anything, let me know in a timely manner today. I do plan on going to bed at some point, but you know, I'm available throughout. I'll be checking my email throughout the day if you have any last ditch questions about the assignment. Next week, we just have the exam. The study guide is up in the week 5 folder. And this weekend, I'm going to put up the exam as well. So you'll have an entire week to work on it. You probably won't need a whole week. It's not that long. But you'll have a whole week to work on the exam. And that's all you have to do for next week is just the exam. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. This was great. Very productive Friday morning. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next week.